I'd like to present Stephen Schlesinger. Stephen Schlesinger is a fellow at the Century Foundation in New York City. He is the former director of the World Policy Institute. He was a writer at Time magazine, served as foreign policy advisor to New York State Governor Mario Cuomo, and worked at the United Nations. He is the author of Act of Creation, The Founding of the United Nations, winner of the 2004 Harry S. Truman Book Award. Mr. Schlesinger.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this extraordinary UNA-USA event, the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. 75 years, that is truly a remarkable number, really a unique one. Remember, the League of Nations lasted only about 20 years or so. Most global alliances have short, very short shelf lives. The UN's survival for 7.5 decades is truly an exceptional accomplishment. Now, why has the UN endured for so long? Well, let's look at its founding history, namely the founding conference of the UN, which occurred, as we all know, in San Francisco in 1945. I wrote about it in my own book, Act of Creation. I think the UN owes most of its durability to the way it was organized originally under the sponsorship of an American president, namely the foremost proponent for an international security body, Franklin Roosevelt. As a young man, you may recall, Roosevelt was a fervent champion of the League of Nations when he was serving as Assistant Secretary of Navy under President Woodrow Wilson. Wilson, of course, was the man who had actually originally proposed the League and then saw it go down to defeat at the hands of the isolationists in the US Senate. But Roosevelt never forgot about the League. Once he began his own presidency, he was determined at some point to resurrect it. In 1941, as the war clouds were gathering in Europe, he first enunciated the principles by which he envisioned how a UN association could come into being. This was in his landmark speech calling for the famous 4 freedoms: the freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Freedoms, he emphasized, that peoples everywhere in the world should enjoy. Then throughout the Second World War, he pushed the idea of the UN forward with his 2 closest wartime allies, Winston Churchill of Great Britain and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. Churchill was at first lukewarm about the UN, and Stalin was at least initially opposed to it. But Roosevelt possessed the political mastery to shepherd it through a number of wartime conferences. Now remember, Roosevelt could well have discarded any notion of a United Nations in 1945. He might have figured, well, the US is today the most powerful country on earth. We can do anything we want. We can act unilaterally as we wish. We can form temporary alliances. We don't need a permanent security facility. But he had the longer vision. He knew after the catastrophe of 2 world wars happening within just 25-year span, wars that had killed nearly 90 million people, that our security could not be a matter of just Fortress USA. We needed allies. Indeed, every nation on earth needed allies. And our safety and that of all countries would be enhanced solely by a universal security body that could act collectively when war threatened. Roosevelt also knew that the time for actually creating such a body was very slim. He had to choose a particular right moment. So he decided on April 1945, the start of the conference, and it was a month before the war in Europe ended. He figured that as the Second World War was winding down, all countries would still be clamoring for a new protective shield against conflict and would therefore all agree to attend this conference. After all, nobody wanted a 3rd World War. Had he tried to do it any earlier when the war was still going on, or had he tried to do it any later, especially after the Cold War began, I doubt today there would have been a UN. Now, why has the organization survived? Roosevelt from the start had a keen sense of the balance between realism and idealism in creating a body like the UN. He had learned bitter lessons from the failure of the League of Nations. He wanted to make sure that the new organization did not replicate any of the League's weaknesses, but still kept its best features. First of all, he formulated language for the UN, that is, for the UN Charter, that made the UN sound like and behave like a global police force, because that's what he and other allies, Churchill and Stalin, wanted. They wanted security in the world. Indeed, if you look at the key passages in the Charter as regards military action, especially in Chapter 7, you will find that it proposes all sorts of armed actions to forestall aggressors, blockades, sanctions, air and sea assaults, a whole arsenal of militaristic tools. Roosevelt did not shy away from the use of force by the United Nations. Second, he recognized that states, rather than elected representatives, had to form the basis of the UN if the organization was going to operate successfully. This was a recognition that the old 1648 Westphalia formula of sovereign nations still dominates and has always dominated the way the world works. The UN, thus, is not a formal democracy, nor a world government with elected representatives. It is a collection of different nations, each with their own political structures and their own appointed ambassadors. This is just a recognition of reality. Third, he sanctioned two crucial organs within the UN, the Security Council and the General Assembly. For him, the Security Council represented realism, and the General Assembly was idealism. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's look at the Security Council first. It reflected the power realities around the globe in 1945. Only 5 nations were given the veto power and permanent membership on the Security Council: the United States, the USSR, Great Britain, France, and China. These were the 5 nations that originally made up the successful wartime alliance. Roosevelt's theory was that only these 5 victors of the war had the sufficient military power and wealth to enforce UN mandates and keep the peace around the globe. Indeed, the Council today makes all the war and peace decisions at the United Nations. Its decisions are binding on all member states. This is in contrast to the League, where all states had the veto, which meant that a single rogue nation could stymie any action by the League, and thus the League's edicts were not really enforceable. They were simply they were not obligatory on member states. Then, on Roosevelt's idealistic side, he supported the creation of the General Assembly, where all states, no matter how big or small, rich or poor, populous or sparsely settled, all had equal votes and could advance their views openly about world problems. Still, its resolutions were not binding on the participant states. Nonetheless, the General Assembly's pronouncements have had a moral force over the years that has not been disregarded. Fourth, he made sure that the Charter itself was a flexible document in its language, much like our American Constitution. Thus, it would be able to be responsive and adaptable to all sorts of crises that might not necessarily be predictable in 1945. And the UN indeed has pioneered all sorts of programs and departments which were never originally mentioned in the Charter, on peacekeeping, environmental protection, an urban agency, election monitoring, counterterrorism, nuclear energy, nation building, all growing out of the central charge at the UN to, quote, maintain international peace and security, end quote. Hence, the UN has been able to survive the Cold War, an expansion from 51 states to 193 states, the refusal of some countries on occasion to even pay UN dues. It's often, and sometimes sorrily, weak responses to crises. For example, even today in Syria or Libya or Yemen. And finally, the inevitable scapegoating that comes with taking on enormous global responsibilities. So clearly we have to say that the UN is not a flawless body. It obviously always needs its changes and updating. After all, even the American Constitution has required amendments from time to time. But the UN has survived because in the end, countries have an ultimate faith that the organization will eventually find its way towards resolving problems and securing the peace. After all, there has been no Third World War, for which we can be eternally grateful. Today, the UN is facing new challenges, as it always does, especially in our own country, where we have an administration in Washington that emphasizes American first policies rather than seeking multilateral or globalistic solutions. Nonetheless, if anything, this institution has proven its durability, and that is its tribute to the vision of a great American president, Franklin Roosevelt, and to an American government that had great foresight about its obligations to the future. And this is a vision that now belongs to all peoples around our planet. I thank you very much.